Hey, welcome to this illustration process mini workshop. My name's Tim McBurney. I've been a professional artist for 20 years, and over the next 2.5 to 3 hours, I'm going to share my thoughts on illustration, and I'm going to share my thoughts on how I think you can improve your composition, how I think you can get more detail and polish in your finished images, and I'm also going to talk about how we can get those higher level professional jobs, both from, again, a process standpoint, heading towards getting the right level of quality, and also just from a general mindset point of view. So I appreciate you checking this out. Let's get started. In this video, which is just going to be a short introduction video, I want to introduce myself a little bit better, talk about who this workshop is for, and outline those key areas that I think a lot of people struggle with that we can use as areas of study going forward. So those main issues are pretty simple, right? The first is, how do I get more detail and polish in my finished images? The second is, how do I improve my composition? The third, which is a little bit more amorphous, but I think often at the core of why we're trying to get good at illustration and what our real sort of, goal and outcome is how do I get people to actually like my work and sort of have that awesome response where they're like, wow, that's cool. And lastly, how do I get good enough to use my illustration in a high-level professional setting? So those are the main key areas that I'm going to cover, again, over the next 2.5 to 3 hours in the subsequent videos. What I want to do just quickly before that is cover who this workshop is for, because I think that will give you a little bit better of an idea about where I'm coming from, right? I'm really into drawing from imagination. And again, I almost take that for granted, right? That's what I always wanted to draw. I'd always look at video games and, comics and stuff like that. And that's sort of what I wanted to do. But not all illustration is obviously based on that. What I'm talking about here is illustration, sort of more or less for the entertainment industry. Again, like animation, comics, video game, concept art, etc., where we're sort of drawing cool, fantasy stuff that often doesn't exist, and we're doing it sort of from our imagination. That's really what I'm about, right? And that's, where a lot of my information is going to be sort of focused. Secondly, I think it's my sort of teaching style, and this is really going to be based on people who want an intuitive learning environment, right? I'm not going to necessarily give a lot of sort of studies and like, hey, do this exercise or whatever. I think the best way to get better at this is just to do it a lot more. And I feel like the goal here is to make that process more enjoyable, more efficient, and to work for us better, right? So it's not just a matter of sort of grinding away, sort of trying different stuff, but we can actually focus on that process and commit to it. I think a lot of good things happen when we do that. It's also for people who want to develop their own line and color-based styles, right? Again, a lot of my advice will really help you with that because that's, again, what I do. And it's linked to that idea of an intuitive learning environment. It's for people who actually want to get better while creating awesome work at the same time. I think there's a lot of sort of ideas and techniques we can use to actually make that happen. And I think that solves a lot of problems right at the same time. And that's something we should strive for. It's also for people who love drawing or want to love drawing, right? Again, everyone has their own relationship to this. But again, I love drawing. I always sort of enjoy sitting down to do it. And I feel like it's important to have a positive relationship to drawing because if we like doing it, we're going to do it more. And if we do it more, we get better. And lastly, it's for people who want to tell stories with their art, again, because that's sort of what I'm into. And a lot of my advice is geared towards helping us do that, helping you do that in your images. So, who is this maybe not for? Again, this will just give you an idea about, where I'm coming from. It's probably going to be, again, a bit of an inverse of those other things. And look, if you want to sort of take this, right, even if you are interested in these other ideas, then go for it, right? You know what I mean? But this just gives you an idea for, maybe, again, where my proclivities lie, what I'm into, what I'm not into, and where my advice is really going to help you and not help you. So it's really not for people who want to draw directly from life or directly from reference. Again, that's not what I do. I don't have a lot of interest in that. I don't have a lot of experience teaching people that. Most of my sort of drawing is from imagination without reference, right? So that's kind of how I just think about the whole thing, right? I've got an idea in my head. I want to sort of draw it out, right? I'm not sort of so interested in finding references and, or doing sort of still life studies and that sort of stuff. Even though I feel like that's all really good, it's just not what I'm about, right? It's also really probably not the best for people who want to use a lot of 3D or photo elements in their work. Again, I sometimes do that in my work. I kind of know how to do that in a professional environment. Very, very, very rarely the stuff you kind of see from me online has any of that sort of stuff in it. But yeah, my approach is really about sort of just creating stuff from imagination. And it's also not for people who want easy clickbait style solutions. Those silly YouTube videos where someone's sort of saying, hey, just do this one thing to improve, or, sort of stuff that's really trying to, make it sound like there's a trick or there's an easy way to do this, right? My opinion is very simple. I think that becoming good at art and, committing yourself to be an artist, whether that is as a hobby or as someone who's aspiring to the very highest professional level, I think it's all the same. We're just committing to continual self-improvement of our ability to draw and create pictures. And it takes time. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of effort, and it takes a lot of energy. And I think that what we actually have to do is commit to that, marshal the correct amount of energy and resources required to overcome that challenge, and try and find all the tools we can to make that as enjoyable and as fun and as exciting as possible, right? I feel like that's where we want to leverage, right? We want to make this as fun and as possible to sit down and spend as much time as we can on this, right? And then make that time as efficient as possible and, again, as enjoyable as possible, right? And again, if you're sort of still like, but someone had some really good clickbait YouTube title or something, just look at their work, right? The proof is in the pudding. If someone had a really good idea that was like better than everyone else's for teaching you drawing, their work better be like twice as good as everyone else, right? Because I know people who are sitting here working at this, have been working at this for, decades, 16 hours a day, just super dedicated, super passionate, right? And everyone says the same thing, right? It's a lot of work. There's no real shortcut. You just have to work on your foundation. Foundation is like the most important thing. And, you just got to practice a lot, right? That's what everyone whose opinion, I respect sort of says. And as far as I'm concerned, that's as close to the truth as we can get, all right? If someone's got a trick, then their work better back it up, right? Otherwise, it's just kind of clickbait nonsense, right? Again, that's sort of obvious, right? You know what I mean? I'm sure you know that. I'm just sort of stating it, right? Because, again, I think it's important. You're not going to find that in this video, right? But I am going to share with you my ideas for, again, how we can make that process more enjoyable and how we can make it more efficient, right? Because again, I think that efficiency and that enjoyment is something that I do see in a lot of the artists who I admire and look up to. And, I've met and I've talked about how they've sort of learnt this stuff, right? They're all super dedicated and they spend hours and hours drawing and they love it, and I feel like that in many ways is the hack, right? Is to get to that place. So anyway, to move on, it's also for people who want to develop, it's not for people who want to develop a painterly style or start their process without a drawing, right? Again, if that's something you want to do and you still are interested in what I've got to say, fine, right? But I'm just sort of saying, I'm one of these people who's a drawer, right? I start with a drawing. I've sort of tried all sorts of different painting processes, right? I've taken hundreds of tutorials and listened to all this kind of stuff. And you know what I mean? I still always just come back to that's kind of how my brain works. I start with the drawing. That's kind of how I think about it. And all my advice is really based around that, starting with a drawing and thinking about it as a drawing first idea. And lastly, again, it's probably not really for people who want to draw hyper realistically, again, because that's just not really what I do. Not to say you might not, learn a lot of stuff. But again, if you're really interested in those sort of ideas, you can maybe check this out, but there's probably other people who are going to be better online at teaching you, again, how to, draw from life, how to draw directly from reference, how to use 3D or photo elements as a major part of your sort of work or process, and, how to get sort of really hyper realistic, right? I can draw kind of realistic, but yeah, I'm not one of those people who's, trying to, make it look photoreal or anything. So anyway, that's just a quick overview of who this is for, who it's not for. Hopefully that gives you a better idea of where I'm coming from, the things that, again, my advice is going to be best able to serve you with. Okay, so let me do a better job of introducing myself. Hi, my name's Tim McBurney, and you might have seen my work on the internet, either on Instagram or ArtStation or YouTube, wherever it is, but you might not be 100% sure, exactly who I am or what am I doing here teaching illustration and concept art and drawing, comic book stuff online with online courses. So the quick overview is that I'm a 20-year veteran of the entertainment industries. So basically I've been a professional artist for 20 years. I've never had any other job. This is all I've ever done, and I'm a full-time drawer, and I always have been. Probably for the last 10 years, I've also been, kind of as a hobby, a drawing teacher where, I teach at a school, CDW Studios in Adelaide, Australia, that's very closely linked to the Flinders University, which is just, a university in sort of South Australia. And, I don't have a university degree. I'm self-taught, but, a big part of what I do is help students there with their basic sort of drawing and illustration skills and sort of basic 2D picture making skills, right? They do other stuff there, they learn 3D and VFX and all that kind of stuff, but I'm responsible for their sort of 2D drawing. So I've actually been, teaching, both online and, in person for about 10 years, right? And I have a lot of experience doing it. I'm also a published author, so I've written and drawn my own sort of book. I'm a published comic book artist, and again, as I said, the easiest way I can explain what I do to people is I'm a full-time drawer, right? I draw stuff, and I've sort of pretty much always been a freelance artist working from home, right? That's where I'm sort of coming from. All right, so a little bit about my career. I actually started as a texture artist in the video game industry, working at a local studio called Ratbag Games in Adelaide, Australia. I went freelance because, again, I'd always sort of aspired to be a freelance artist. I feel like, again, I always sort of, would read books of my favorite, artists that I'd aspire to be like. And they were often sort of illustrators and, people who are, doing fantasy book covers and that sort of stuff. And they always worked from home, and so that's sort of what I always wanted to do. I always wanted to, be one of those people with a home studio, doing art for various people, right? I don't know why, that's just sort of what I always sort of imagined doing. And so I sort of did that. Through my travels doing that, I, started working in the French comic book industry. And I spent a lot of my career basically drawing comics, again, in the French comic book industry. Here's a book which was an adaptation of Pinocchio written by David Chevelle based on the traditional Adventures of Pinocchio book by Carlo Collodi. So again, I've had the opportunity to work in a variety of different styles, and this really allowed me to work in, again, that sort of French comic book style, those big sort of pages, where, again, it was me being able to create the penciling and the design and the inking, and the lettering and the coloring, do all of it, right? That's what I really sort of enjoyed doing. And again, the French comic book industry was a really good way for me to do that. So again, I did that for quite a while. Here's the book Ara that I wrote and drew, which again was another sort of really good opportunity. I've always really liked the idea of, again, me as the artist being sort of, able to create the whole thing. I like that from, again, drawing comics, and I've done a few Kickstarters where I've also, been able to create for board games, all of the art, right? Working with a friend where he did all the game design and I did all the art. I've done that a few times and I really like it. I think doing that is super satisfying as an artist, right? Is, again, when I get to create the whole thing from start to finish and, again, make a lot of those decisions and, again, have that finished product that I was a big part of it at the end. But probably for the last, I'd say, 6 or 7 years, I've been really focusing on concept art for the entertainment industry. So doing concept art for feature animations, animation, video games, again, big studios, small studios. My style is sort of quite specific, so it really is based on sort of who needs me for a particular project at a particular time. But I'm also, just an illustrator, and that's what this course is really about. Most of these things really at their core are about making pictures, but I also do, classic sort of illustration where someone will just sort of, email me and say, hey, we've got this thing, we need an image like this, for our project, can you do it? Right. And so again, I do all these sort of different things. If you've seen a lot of my work, online on Instagram or ArtStation, the majority of that is actually just personal work, right? And I've always been into doing that sort of personal work, from the earliest days of the internet, where we're just sort of creating stuff, posting it up, sharing it with people. I've always really liked doing that. And that's, the majority of the work you sort of see from me. Right, it's just me in my spare time, creating fun things, just because I have stuff rattling around in my head, in my imagination, and I want to sort of put it down onto the page and make it real. So again, that's a quick overview of my career, just to give you an idea for, where I've sort of come from and the things that I've done. Just a quick note on my education. It's pretty simple. I'm basically as self-taught as you can get in this space. When I was, where I was growing up in Adelaide, Australia, there was no good educational opportunities. So I had to teach myself this basically on my own. And it was lucky that the internet was around, just very starting out to be sort of interesting at that stage. But there was no YouTube, there were no, people just sort of sharing online tutorials. People were sharing advice on art on forums. But, I basically had to figure this out from looking at, magazines and books. Again, talking to people, getting feedback online. As soon as online courses became available, I was all over that, buying sort of DVD courses and those sorts of things and watching people draw. And that made a huge difference, right? That's kind of why I'm here. I always liked, looking at tutorials. I still buy tutorials all the time. It's sort of interesting to see how other people work and what their approaches are. So that's kind of what I'm doing here. Is, I'm sharing this information, and I'm kind of really interested in the idea of blending, again, my experience and my knowledge of how to learn stuff by yourself, right? And a lot of that stuff is, again, just do it, right? But again, there's sort of things that I learned to optimize that along the way. And also, again, I've had a lot of experience, having to teach people in a formal sort of college university environment, where, I've had to study exactly how you sort of teach people how to draw and what the fastest ways are, and how everyone has a different way of learning, right? It can be very challenging when you've got like 100 people, and you got to teach them all the same sort of stuff, but they all learn differently, right? We're all different. So again, I'm one of those people who really enjoys just doing it myself. I really just like going at my own pace. And sort of learning about what I'm interested in right at that time, right? That's sort of how I sort of learn. So a big part of what, again, what I'm doing here is again, I always liked online courses. I always liked tutorials. So I like sort of making them. I like that idea of sharing this information and trying to blend, again, the best sort of practices that you would find in a university, sort of high-end college environment, for, drawing exercises and all these kind of things. Not a lot of that has to do with illustration. Illustration is to me is a little bit different. But again, all of that basic drawing sort of knowledge, taking that and combining it with, again, my experience of what it's like to just be by yourself, trying to figure this out on your own, right? So again, that's just a little bit of a background of sort of, where I sort of came from, what my educational experience is. Okay, let's take a look at these 4 main issues. So again, there may be more issues than this. Some of these might not 100% directly relate to the things you are struggling with right now, but in my experience, these are the key areas that I think we can use to help improve our illustration. And they were all things that I struggled with, and they're things that I feel like I often feel are at the core of the problems that people are struggling with. So these hopefully will help you to think about how better to improve your illustration. The first is, how do you get more detail and polish in your finished images? Now, this is one of these things. I would always struggle with this. I would always get feedback notes, even when I was working professionally, that were like, oh, that's cool, but, we just need another pass. We need another detail pass. And I'd be like, no, not again. Or, very early on, I would sort of post stuff up to the internet and, people would be like, oh, that's cool. Can't wait till you finish it. Or, sort of like, oh, yeah, that's cool. Keep going. And I really just didn't know what to do. I'd try, and I feel like the best way I can explain this concept and what I want to sort of talk about is how to fix this problem where you're working on an image and you get it to a certain point. Now, you know it needs more, right? We're not silly. This is the thing. It's not like it was never for me, and I feel like it's probably not for you, that you're sitting there saying, oh, I'm just dumb. I don't know that it needs more detail. It's like, I always knew it needed more detail, and I feel like often you probably know it needs more detail or it needs more something. It's not like, it's not having that finish, that professional kind of high level finish, but what happens is every time you do something else to it, you make it worse, right? This was what I was sort of dealing with is, I would sort of, be working on something and I'd be like, oh yeah, this is kind of cool. This is looking good. And I'm like, I know it needs more polish, but every time I like try and add polish, like I do what I think you would need to do to make it more detailed, it looked worse. And there was this point where it's kind of like sketchy and a little bit more amorphous where I felt like it would sort of be good. And I just couldn't get it past that point. So again, that's the real question there, is how do we solve that problem, right? The second thing is, how do I improve my composition? So this is one of these areas that, again, I feel like we often get sort of feedback or sort of, it comes up as an idea that like illustration or picture making involves this idea of quote unquote composition, and, we need to improve it, right? So, composition in many ways, I sort of just view as like what makes a picture good. It's like, it's these abstract ideas people are talking about when they're sort of saying like, is the picture good or not? And certainly if you do have that high level of detail, but your composition is not good, then it's not really going to connect with an audience. And this is one of these things that I feel like is very tricky to get our head around properly. I feel like this word means different things to different people. I think it means different things depending on what medium you're in, whether in photography or illustration, or again, even if you're working in one style versus another style. So, again, I'll share with you, again, my basic ideas for how we can improve our composition. And again, spoiler alert, my basic thesis is I think the best thing you can do there is just sort of work on your thumbnails and work on your ability to kind of look at other images you really like. And again, as I sort of said, I'm more into the intuitive sort of version of doing that, as opposed to doing sort of abstract studies and little sort of experimental things, or sort of drawing lines over masterworks or anything like that, right? I really think the best way you can do this is just to work at it, right? To just do lots of compositional thumbnails and really sort of build that muscle of understanding how a picture is made. So the next thing is, how do I get people to like my work, right? How do we get that response? I feel like, again, this would be something that I was always chasing and I was always sort of after. And I feel like it's the same thing most people are after when they're sort of creating images, is when we first saw those really cool things that inspired us to become artists, we had that feeling like, oh my God, this is so awesome, right? And you kind of want that same response, right? Because often we have a cool idea in our head and we want someone else to be like, oh, I see your cool idea. That is really cool, right? It's very simple, but it's also very amorphous, right? But these are the kind of questions I like tackling, right? I don't want to shy away from these things because this is important, right? It's not just kind of like, oh yeah, well, you'll never be able to do that, or that's, don't worry about it. I think that's at the core of what we're trying to do. And again, I want to talk to that and try and give you some ideas about how we can think about that. And again, my sort of advice based on, again, my experience of trying to sort of make that happen and seeing what works and what doesn't work. And also doing the same thing, again, talking to students I've sort of talked to and what's helped them and what's not helped them get that thing. I also know this is an issue that plagues people who are already professional artists, right? Is often they get jobs and they get stuff, but they're not able to really get that sort of work. They're not able to really get that thing happening where they produce work, at their work, and other people are being like, wow, that's sort of awesome. You know what I mean? They're not getting that response, right? And, so it's not like this is something that, once you become a professional artist, this kind of goes away, right? I feel like it's something we're always sort of struggling with, depending on, again, how we move medium or change stuff around, right? What sort of, again, new approach we take. How do we get that response from the viewer. The last thing is, how do I get good enough to use my illustration in a high-level professional setting? So this is another one of those things that I feel like is a little bit sort of amorphous, but I feel like there's a lot of things I can sort of share with you based on my experience of this. And again, things I feel like work and don't work. A lot of this I think comes down to process and having a solid process. But anyway, you can check out the more detailed answers to all of these things in the following videos. I basically break down, again, how I think this problem sort of manifests and things that I've sort of found help to kind of, get a positive result here. But in the next video, what I want to do is actually share a little bit more of my journey as an artist, to sort of share, again, like how I sort of started, what my work looked like when it was starting out, when it was beginning, and sort of how that progressed, and how these issues really affected me throughout my journey, and again, how I sort of started to overcome them, right? So check that out in the next video. I basically talk about, my journey as an artist from, starting out very early on, again, to sort of getting to a point where I did feel like I had that sort of competency when I was working in those sort of professional environments, right? So anyway, we'll see you in the next video there.